take your seats. All right, well, a warm good morning to each and every one of you. And all right, thank you. Welcome to the Compassion in Action Roundtable on advancing compassion and service strategies at the state level. And many of you know that this is part of a monthly series of Compassion in Action Roundtables, each of which has focused on a specific area of human need. These have ranged from addiction and at-risk youth, prisoner reentry, and homelessness on the domestic front to things like global HIV/AIDS and malaria in Africa. And they seek to dig into these issues in a way that asks the fundamental question that is at the heart of the Faith-Based and Community Initiative. Can we bring new solutions to age-old problems? Can we bring together the strengths that government has with the frontline community organizations that have a touch that government in its own never ever can match? And that's the question we're going to be asking today, but it will not be in quite the same fashion as before because it's not focused on one specific issue, but in many ways is asking this about all of these issues and honing in on states and asking how they can bring together the vision that a governor, the State Service Commission has for its volunteerism strategy with this faith-based and community initiative vision for drawing upon the frontline community organizations, the groups that are there sharing the same zip code as the challenges they're facing that bring a touch that government alone never has. And there are some folks in this room who are doing that incredibly well. The goal here isn't to tell from the White House perspective how it's done, but to look at how it is being done by some of the leaders from our states. And so all of us at the White House are excited not only to share certain things that we're going to be hearing from Jay, but also to hear how in the real world this is happening day in and day out, and look at how this can be expanded to other states all across the country. So it is my great pleasure to introduce, for the last time in this current role, Mr. Jay Hine. As many of you know, Jay has led this faith-based and community initiative for the last 2 years, and he will be stepping away from that role. This is his last official day on this job. But as hopefully he will iterate, and I'm sure many of you who know him are already aware, he views this as simply a transition to another facet of a broader movement, a movement that seeks to engage the strengths of government, yes, but to do it in a way that is no longer the large and bureaucratic and distant approach that had often been emphasized in the past, but that's continually emphasizing the touch of frontline healers. And so Jay will be providing our opening remarks, and please give a very rousing welcome to Jay Hine.
Thank you very much. Thank you. How kind. Hi. Good morning. Good morning. Thank you for that welcome. It is my last day, and I couldn't think of a better way to spend it because our work isn't done. And what has animated our interest in this initiative gets us up every morning, just as it gets you up every morning, is that human need is just all too present. And so the President of the United States gave us the marching orders when he took office and said, when we see human need, we're going to notice it and we're going to care, and then we're going to respond. And we're going to respond by, as Jed said, organizing government as effectively as possible to support the healers. You know, to look first to faith-based and community groups and to rally volunteers and equip them to so that we can reach further together. And so it's an us strategy. And so today, I get to spend my last day filling out some forms this afternoon, and my staff is like, no, it's your last day, and you're going to have like a public event, and you're going to be, what are you doing to us? And they know why I wanted to do this, because it's their heartbeat too, because we just want to race through the finish line to whenever we have a responsibility as great as we have in these jobs, you just want to fulfill it. And so it's a great honor to be here with you and to share the time and to roll up sleeves and say, how might we just do this thing a little bit better together? And that's indeed what the whole Roundtable series has been about, the Compassion Action Roundtables, which started in January 2007. So this is number, 20? I'm really good at math, you can tell. So however months it's been since January of 2007. And the point is, have one every month, and we're going to keep having them as long as the president's in office. And what it reveals is, sadly, the dimensions of human need. We've talked about 30 million people in modern-day slavery that are victims of human trafficking. We've talked about those who hunger at home and abroad, and those afflicted by AIDS as patients or as orphans in Africa. We've talked about prisoners that face housing and employment discrimination at home in an unacceptable way. We've talked about the dropout crisis, on and on and on. So at one level, we've talked about human need with a face on it. Another level, we've talked about many of my heroes, which are in the room, and that's the leaders at the state agency, Faith-Based and Community Initiative. And so what we do at the White House is try and lift their arms up a little bit so that they can serve you more effectively, because that's where the work gets done from a federal government standpoint. We don't just seek the next piece of legislation. We try and operate justice programs and training programs and housing programs more effectively. And those agencies do better when they understand that really, historically, and at our best form, government solves problems when they do have dynamic public-private partnerships. Since World War II, some political scientists like to call this government by proxy. It's what we've done. We've been in the business of government paying the nonprofit sector to do this work because you're the best at it. And this president, why I'm so proud to serve him and so pleased to be in this role, has just been more intentional about that. And he said, we need to understand it better. And what is the faith factor within that? And who are these groups? And are we dealing with big groups or small groups? And how can we grow it? And how can we be more nimble? And that's what our work is all about. And that work is done at the agencies. And so, politicians and the media might say, well, what about the legislative battle on these 2 points that are in the headlines? And we say that's important. And we'll pay attention to that. But the majority of the story is service that first happens in community, driven by human need, and by the artfulness with which, in the shadows, our state agencies and federal agencies conceive of better ways to do the business. And so these roundtables were an elaborate excuse to reveal those dimensions of the story, the dimensions of human need, the dimensions of innovation that we're orchestrating to correspond. And so today, as Jed mentioned, we're here not to talk about a particular need, but to talk about a host of needs. Disaster response may look a little bit like a particular need as we consider Faye in Wendy's comments. She's left the floodwaters to come join us, and she's going to get right back. And Gustav, and what's the other one that's right behind it? Right behind it. So, I talked about our work, with a sense of urgency facing us, and those disasters are indeed reminding us forcefully what it's all about. But let me just sort of widen the angle view just a little bit. And then I'm going to get out of your way so you can hear from the experts, actually, that have something substantive to share with you. But I worked in welfare reform years ago, so I looked at how government could do better in conceiving poverty reduction programs. And that's what I did in the early and mid-'90s. And that's a bit of what we do here. We're thinking about how government can re-engineer itself to do better to meet social distress. But in the midst of it, I realized the insufficiency of only asking the government question, and I realized that you exist, faith-based and community groups, in force. You're the ones that really lead the show, and that there's these things called volunteers that aren't just kind of sweet, and nice to have, but necessary ingredients to solve problems, to populate the nonprofits, and to show up and meet human need. So I see this place in North Carolina, Asheville, North Carolina. Buncombe County it's called. I studied it. I'm a researcher. And so I did a case study of this group. They were bewildered by the 40 million people, and they read the headlines all the time. 40 million uninsured in America, and it's just awful. And the medical community there wanted to do something about it, and they thought that the early 90s energy behind health reform, maybe leading toward a national solution, might be their hope. And when that didn't become a solution for them, on the heels of other national solutions, bipartisan efforts that didn't turn into reality, they just decided to get around the table in Buncombe County to say, well, we don't have 40 million uninsured in Buncombe County. We have 13,000. And we could probably do something about 13,000 if we organized. And so what they did is realize that their solution would be voluntarism. They thought, that's our strategy. And that strategy in medical context looks like charity care. So they thought if we could just get the doctors to do a little bit, each of them, or most of them, we could easily get the 13,000 in systems, and we could maybe do it in such a way that gives the patients dignity and responsibility, and then they could hopefully get healthy, get employed, and have their own plans, or what. Let's turn a dysfunctional system into a functional system for our community. There were 3 problems with charity care in Buncombe County and every other place that makes us not be able to go to scale. The first problem is if you're a doc that does charity care, the reputation is you're a doc that does charity care. So you get 100 people outside your door, and so if you serve one, you're going to serve 100 or have to deal with that problem. The second problem is, by definition, you're dealing with people who are poor. So if you prescribe medications, unlike us with health insurance plans, they're not going to get their prescriptions filled, and they're not going to get healthier. So you've wasted time, yours and theirs. And third, you need specialty docs sometimes, not just primary care docs. And so the long story short in Buncombe County is that the Medical Society came in to rationalize this conversation and say, let's fix those 3 problems. Let's, at the Medical Society, be the referral system. So any of the 13,000 that want in and want care have to come through us. So primary care docs are only going to have to see 10 a year, and after you've seen your 10th patient, you're done. Specialty docs, you can see 20 because it's one-off appointments, but they tend to stay around a primary doc. So we're going to rationalize it that way. We're going to protect you and your time. And the county, let's take a bet on this county that if we serve people this way, they're going to stop coming to the emergency room, and they're going to save you money on that end. And so the county paid for the prescriptions. And so they saved money in racing to the end in that bargain, because the ER systems went down from like 80% to 20%, and they paid for the prescriptions. And then the docs, there's 9 and 10 doctors in Buncombe County that participate as volunteers in a charity care system that serves 13,000 people who are uninsured in Buncombe County. So you can make the argument, and I would, that they've fixed the national healthcare crisis in their community because people decided to care, and they decided to give of themselves, and they were smart, really smart. They were rational strategies that were united. So I studied that system and thought, let's take that to scale. What does it look like to be a part of a movement that smartly engages volunteers, that gets systems to work together? You had, capitalist, sort of business guys, and you had do-gooder types, and you had government bureaucrats. They were all at the table, and they were neighbors, and they had a sizable sort of a deal. And that's why community matters. That's why I love our middle name. It reminds some people we're not just about faith. We're very, focused on the faith factor because it plays big in volunteerism and philanthropy. But we're into community because we're into the whole nonprofit sector. But the bigger notion is that we know this work gets done in community, and we know that our measure should be community in the end. And so this Buncombe County example, I think, is instructive for what we're going to talk about today, because we can organize locally much more effectively and sustainably than we can organize in Washington, D.C. Yet there's a role for us here, so keep listening to the other side. But let me first say that we are talking about historic story here. Buncombe County didn't invent volunteerism and nonprofits and civic association. Tocqueville, you've read this French philosopher who talked about when tragedy befalls an individual, these Americans, purse strings of 1,000 strangers open up to them. And I've often said that he got it half right, that he observed that people care for one another. They didn't wait for a state solution as our country was formed, but it wasn't a stranger that opened up his pocketbook. It was a neighbor. It was somebody that was probably in a relationship with them. Well, that quote or that sentiment years ago has turned in today the philanthropic sector of the United States. Last year, we hit for the first time more than $300 billion in private giving. It's the first time we exceeded $300 billion. And when you study this stuff, you realize that most of the giving is small. It's rolled up a bunch of your gifts, that you give to your place of worship or your favorite charity, and that's how we get to $300 billion, because a lot of us participate. It's a huge number, and it's very unique, and it's very unusual to a lot of the other nations, of course. It's very common to us and uncommon to others. And it's one of our greatest exports, actually, too. So today, this $300 billion figure, just to put it in context, if we have crack research team, I'm embarrassed, Diane Davis, she gave me this statistic as we were thinking of what in proportion, $300 billion is kind of in government, $300 billion for this, $300 billion, that's a big number, of course, but how do you put it in context? Diane found that the presidential campaigns last year amounted to collectively $580 million, which if you only thought about that and you think of the nature of how campaigns have grown, you think, man, that's a lot of money. And it is. It's less than 1/4 of 1% of our charitable giving. You know, we just give at a high level. Our donation collectively of $300 billion is a larger gross domestic product than 12 of our Western allies. You know, so just what we give is just enormous. Well, that fits within the larger sector, the nonprofit sector, of which there are 1.5 million or so registered nonprofit charities. And the collective revenue, $680 billion or so, the annual revenue of those organizations, or the collected assets, the wealth of these organizations, more in the 1.7 trillion range, would be the sixth largest economy. Our nonprofit sector would be the sixth largest economy in the world if it were a separate country. So this is just a big deal. You all are rolled up into a really big deal. You're a big deal in the lives of the people you serve, most importantly. But collectively, in America, it's a force, and it's a big force that we need to understand better, and we need to do business more effectively with. And fortunately, the presidents of the United States, do I do this, or I just push it? Display my technological prowess. There's the Buncombe County story. A little late on that one. Sorry. Sorry about that. Diane worked so hard to prepare it for me. So you could hear this story. You could hear about civil society and civic association, volunteers and nonprofits and think, do we even need the government? That's a traditional conservative argument. You know, leave it to the market, leave it to private enterprise. Typical liberal argument, no, it's all about the government. It was just those are just false polars. Because we have to work and leverage, as Jed said eloquently, together the strengths of each and to work together. And a bunch of presidents have recognized that, which is pretty special. It is the 75th anniversary of the National Civilian Conservation Corps, which was a response to the Depression that Franklin Delano Roosevelt led. And it was kind of a national service deal. You know, it was government paying for service and getting able-bodied young men engaged in meaningful labor that actually improved a lot of our public lands. It was a terrific experiment, very successful. And presidents since, John Kennedy famously, signed an executive order to start the Peace Corps. I can't tell you how many times I've been asked that question. Well, you know, the Faith-Based Community Initiative is only executive order, so, you know, you think it's sustainable? Well, the Peace Corps is doing all right, you know, and so if you have a good idea, you know, it grows, and I think that ours will too. But John Kennedy started the Peace Corps, and he knew that by Americans giving of their time and their talent and their influence abroad in a charitable, humane way, that we would understand the developing world better, and the developing world would understand us better. And the Peace Corps has been magnificent on that score. Lyndon Johnson, following Kennedy, did VISTA. President Nixon did Senior Corps. Jimmy Carter, of course, famous in his support for Habitat for Humanity. Post-presidency, did other things as a president. President Reagan had an office of private sector initiatives that galvanized the sector and aimed to support it. He also started Take Pride in America. There was a lot of vandalism in our public national parks in the 80s, and said, look, it's a great stewardship opportunity for us to have access to so many lands, but it's really our responsibility to also then care for it. So that's been a successful initiative. And then the last three have a very interesting relationship. President Bush 41 had an Office of National Service that was located in this building, actually. And it did demonstration projects. For example, took city year to scale and did other innovations, which was great. And that morphed into the Points of Light, where he could recognize volunteers and award you know, sort of presidential recognition for community service, which is terrific and work that continues to today. But when he left office in a competitive contest with President Clinton and sort of the spirit of democracy that I love about our country, they have a peaceful transition. And in that transition, President Bush, as he's handing over the keys to President Clinton, said, take care of my Points of Light. And President Clinton said, I will, and I'll grow it. So he takes the Office of National Service, creates the Corporation for National and Community Service, and fulfills a campaign pledge he had made to help provide college help for those that give of, Michael, you know a little bit about this, the service side that you'll be speaking to. And so the Corporation for National and Community Service turns into an engine that you'll hear more about and has served us so effectively, and did other efforts to promote volunteerism. And so then President Clinton completes his term and hands the keys over to another Bush, our boss here, the President 43, and says, your father asked me to take care of his points of light. Literally, this story happened, and I want you to take care of the Corporation for National and Community Service. And the president said, I will, and I'll grow it. The same spirit. And so we have done that, and you'll hear a little bit about it. I'll say a couple things about it. But what President Bush did is turned these programmatic strategies in recognition of the strength of the sector and our desire to grow the sector, and turned a little bit more systemically to say, we're going to make this a central governing strategy. We're going to make this effort not really just a program. We'll have a bunch of programs probably, a pluralism of them, but we'll think like this. When we see human need, as I said earlier, we'll look first to faith-based community groups and to volunteers and to call people into action. His first inaugural used these words: what you do is as important as anything government does. This is the president to the citizens in an inaugural. I ask you to seek a common good beyond your comfort, to serve your nation, beginning with your neighbor. I ask you to be citizens, citizens not spectators, citizens not subjects, responsible citizens, building communities of service and a nation of character. Americans are generous and strong and decent, not because we believe in ourselves, but because we hold beliefs beyond ourselves. When this spirit of citizenship is missing, no government program can replace it. When this spirit is present, no wrong can stand against it. So these words mattered. He gave his first policy address on the campaign trail called Duty of Hope, which talked about the armies of compassion and has become an animating strategy. So he's done a number of things. I'm going to tick off just very quickly a half dozen or so of them to show some of our record and some of our movement, but the context or the character of my remarks I'd like to share with you is that this is more of a movement. This isn't like a bunch of individual parts. This is about growing the natural strengths of America and emboldening them, celebrating them, lifting them up, but somehow turning this engine of the federal government toward it, to galvanize it and to sustain it and to grow it. So one of the first things he did was used his words, the inaugural address and other speeches. He's given dozens and dozens of speeches. Stay tuned for September 8th, where he'll give a speech on volunteerism and maybe make some announcement on the continued call to service to our nation. But words matter, particularly when you're President of the United States, and so he's spoken into that. And my belief is that he's changed a culture as a result of it. You know, there's more recognition of this sector and volunteers, and there's more appreciation for them, particularly oftentimes in the realm of faith-based contributions. He signed an executive order, multiple of them, but the first one, 9th day in office, that created our office at the White House and some of the cabinet agencies. He signed successive orders to grow volunteerism strategies and nonprofit strategies at other agencies. And so he took executive fiat. Rockefeller Institute has called this administrative presidency, taking administrative action, and I agree with that. And it's good government, I believe. In his 2002, so third, his 2002 State of the Union address, he issued a call to service. We were post 9/11. We were hurting, and he knew that we needed to all have a role, and so he asked each of us to dedicate 2 years of service to our country. He wasn't making us do it. He just said our country's gonna be better for it if you do that, and we do it sort of collectively. So he issues this call to service. We throughout the federal government have demonstration projects where he said, let's take the hardest problems. Let's go into the prisons and consider how the 600,000+ prisoners leaving federal and state institutions can come back to community and not have 2/3 of them be rearrested, which is the national statistic, but instead to be employed and housed and integrated back into society. So we have a demonstration project called Prisoner Reentry. We have demonstration projects on access to recovery and so many others to be able to say, we're going to take the really thorny, hard problems, we're going to take the best talent in America, go after it, we're going to learn from that, what worked, what didn't, and why, and we're going to infuse those lessons into and around government. We have acted under the belief that if you're not counting, you're just practicing. That you need measurement, that you need accountability. And so in our demonstration projects we have measures, and in other government programs we have measures. But we also did something, the corporation did something so meaningful, I think, in the Bureau of Labor Statistics. We started quantifying volunteerism to give teeth and heft to this question. And three of the interesting findings I have gleaned from the research, and David Eisner and Corporation communicates so well, is the trends you can learn from data. Not only that 61 million Americans volunteer, and that's powerful, and the combined labor force that represents really shows how muscular the nonprofit and volunteerism sector is. But then you see the trend lines, and you see the boomers. I don't mean to be taking your speech, I hope I'm not. So you see the boomers and their critical role and their growth in the future, and how they're going to be more available and more interested, and the millennials, the late teens, early 20s that want to engage. And so you learn that from data, and you see the numbers. And the other thing you learn is the faith factor that came from the research, that 23 million Americans, or 35% of volunteers, are motivated by their faith, or they volunteer through faith-based organizations. It's the leading portal, or it's the leading platform with which to do service. So that is just interesting. Whether you are of faith, of different faiths, or no faith at all, if you're interested in a better America, that's a leading indicator. That's really important to understand and to do business with. But you also need to build on your islands of health and strength. And so we've grown Peace Corps, and we've grown AmeriCorps, and we've grown Learn and Serve, and then we've started new initiatives, Citizen Corps, and other new initiatives that need to respond. Because why? Because need outpaces supply, because social needs continues to call us into action, as it should. So I will wrap up here by way of saying the future isn't the '08 campaign. That's interesting. And I think that the candidates are supportive of this vision. They're going to be doing a summit, I think, in September on service, and they've both spoken to the Faith-Based and Community Initiative, and that's all good, and that's very important. But that the future is in the place it started, which is communities. And the best way we know how to affect communities, from Washington, D.C. and the White House and the federal agencies, is through state government and through governors and innovative state officials. And that is why we're gathered today to consider service strategies, which is a collective strategy, and to look through the lens of state leadership, to celebrate 4 innovators, one in absentia. The Indiana director wasn't able to join us because of a family emergency, but we have 3 very innovative states that we're just going to celebrate today and thank them for their terrific leadership, and learn from them to see how we can grow volunteerism strategies and nonprofit partnerships all across the country, because you are the future, and they are your best ally. So we're going to do our best for 4 more months vigorously to support you from Washington, D.C., but the states will be sustainability agents, and so we're gonna recognize that quick. And with that word, I thank each of you for coming today, and I'll now introduce Michael Harrington, who's gonna share another view, a deeper view of the corporation's role. Corporation's a terrific partner. I'm pleased to invite him to the podium now, and thank you all again for joining us.
Well, good morning, everyone. And I promise to be brief because I really am the sort of transition piece between the two. Jay did a wonderful job of setting up our discussion today and about the corporation's role and the history of service in our country and how that's developed over the past few generations. And I'm going to have the pleasure of introducing 3 women who are at the forefront of local leadership in connecting our faith-based communities to national service. This is an especially significant and appropriate place for me to be today in discussing this. On Saturday of last week, I learned that my 75-year-old father, who'd been suffering from cancer, passed away peacefully at home. And so I've spent the last week in South Carolina with family and friends. As a matter of fact, on Wednesday, as I was sitting underneath the tent at the services, and the Army chaplain was delivering the eulogy about my father and praising his service in the Korean War, during which he was awarded the Bronze Star for valor. And as I considered the community of faith, of friends and family that surrounded me, and as the honor guard presented my older brother with the commemorative American flag, I thought to myself how inextricably linked faith and service are in our country. And I felt very proud of that. Then after retiring home with my family to a veritable mountain of food, and again with family and friends, and I think there were 6 Southern pound cakes, and I swear one of them was pink. I realize that compassion is that other component that we have so much to be proud about, and we have service and compassion together. There's very little that we can't do. We see that service and compassion reflected in so many ways. We see it in organizations, faith-based organizations like Habitat for Humanity that are so well known, that have done so much as to eliminate poverty housing in communities across the country. We see it in small community faith-based organizations like Trinity Christian Community in New Orleans, who started out as a tutoring program and not from the ashes but from the mud of Katrina, arose and rebuilt into a vital rebuilding organization that have rebuilt hundreds of homes and engaged thousands of volunteers in the recovery of that city. So we look at these things and we see what is possible. And I'm very proud that I have the opportunity to work with the Corporation for National and Community Service. Jay gave the background, the history of how it came about, and it was a very good and very powerful. The Corporation for National and Community Service really does reach out through communities, and I think that's what I like about it best. When Katrina happened, when there were emergencies, the first response at our agency was, what do we need to do? How do we need to change? How do we need to adapt to this new environment? How can we work with our local partners, whether it's with Senior Corps and our elder adults, Learn and Serve America with our students and young people, or the program with which I work, AmeriCorps, which covers the breadth and depth of participation throughout the country. Now, I work with AmeriCorps State, and that's the very best. Of course, I'm biased. But AmeriCorps State, I work with the 52 state and territory gubernatorially appointed service commissions. And these are people who have their pulse on what's happening in the states around our country. They work, all the resources that our agency provides are provided through these commissions, who in turn galvanize, work with local organizations to really build and to leverage that impact to make a difference. When President Bush was elected, and he said, we want to take down the walls between what's happening between your programs and faith-based agencies, the first thing the corporation did was work with our state commissions to see what were the problems, what strategies did we need to implement. Some of it was purely around language, that sort of historical barrier of feeling like, well, we can't work together, but actually we can. So we changed what we talked about, how we talked about it. We found that in many of our programs, where the National Civilian Community Corps, which is the descendant of the Civilian Conservation Corps that Jay talked about, that we were already working with many local faith-based organizations, carrying on that tradition of the CCC. The state commissions were already funding many faith-based programs, so we wanted to expand that. We also looked at training and technical assistance and what we could provide, what online resources. But more than anything else, we engaged our commissions and we did our best to empower them to be successful. I like to say that over the last 3 years, we've had a lot of success. In the portfolio that I manage, over the last 3 years, fully 10 to 30% of all the new programming that we do has been through two self-identified faith-based or organizations partnering with faith-based organizations in their community. And that's pretty powerful. It shows you that there is a desire and a need, a diversity of faith throughout our country that reflects the diversity of this great nation. This is the sort of promise, the sort of success we intend and want to build on. We brought on someone like Krista on board to bring leadership and coherence to our plans and strategy. And Krista, you've been invaluable in doing that. And these sorts of dialogues, these sorts of roundtables, the venues across the country that we've had, have allowed us to understand how we need to change in the way that we work so that we can empower the people we work with in the field to accomplish even more. So since then, with all those new programmings, we have seen literally every year, we have funded hundreds more faith-based organizations that employ thousands of AmeriCorps members and tens of thousands of volunteers. I'm very proud of that accomplishment. And now I think, as the director of AmeriCorps, Krista McSwain, always likes to say, I'm going to do what the corporation does when it's at its best. I'm going to get out of the way and let the local folks talk about the success they've been having. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael and Jay. I'm Krista Sisterhen, and I work with the Corporation for National Community Service, and it's my pleasure to moderate a panel of experts, of servants, and of people who kind of embrace the responsibilities they have with a particular grace and joy, and that will come through as you get to hear from them. Who we have with us is Wendy Spencer from Florida, and the Volunteer Florida, and Susan Weddington from One Star Foundation in Texas, and Sydney Hoffman from the Governor's Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives in Alabama. These three women represent governors who've had the wisdom to combine their state commissions on volunteerism with their statewide faith-based and community initiative. And they have been in that capacity as a combined entity for more than 3 years. So they've got a story to tell. You know, sometimes it takes a while to get the wind in your sails and to make some progress. And these women represent organizations and states that have done just that. There are a number of states in the United States that have combined their commissions. We've done some highlights of those in your program so that you'll have a sense of how those things have come together. We're privileged to have another one of those combined leaders in our midst, Cheryl from Baltimore, from in the state of Maryland, and the Governor's Office of Community Initiatives there, who brought a lot of friends with her, and we're grateful for that this morning, and we're happy to have you here. What I'd like to do is first ask each of our panelists just to give us a snapshot of how their organizations came to the place where they are today. How did they decide to become a merged entity, and how do they function today? And that'll be our first question. And Wendy, I'll ask you to kick us off.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Welcome, everyone. We're glad to be here. And if I can take just a little quick editorial speaker's privilege, I want to announce something special that we want to do for Jay today. You're still here? Okay, you're here. Good. Jay, we really appreciate the work that you've done. You've been an amazing mobilizer, galvanizer. I mean, you've really taken the vision of the president and brought it to a whole new level. And so we think about you as being sort of the expanded limbs and the leaves and the blooms on the trees that the president has planted for us. So, from Florida, and on behalf of state commissions, and I will speak for Susan and Sydney and all of our commissions, we want to plant a tree in your behalf to represent all the good work and the growth that you've done. So thank you so much. It's a special day for you and for us as well, so thank you for that. We're the Governor's Commission on Volunteerism and Community Service. Governor Christ is our leader in Florida, and he's very enthusiastic about support of civic engagement and service, faith and community-based initiatives. And we are very, very blessed to have a broad scope of work in our commission, which was established in 1994, one of the first commissions established in Florida statute. 14.29 covers our organization, and we're very pleased with that. But we have 25 governor-appointed, Senate-confirmed commissioners, bipartisan in Florida, of course. And what we did to expand not only the commission itself as a government entity, is we also have the support of a designated support organization, a nonprofit 501c3 foundation that really allows us to expand our ability to serve much beyond the restrictions of a state entity. Not all commissions have that ability, but we're very pleased with it. We think it's a good model, and we encourage other state commissions to do so. And what it also did is really at the call to service and the vision of President Bush, when Governor Bush was serving, followed the lead and suggestion of lifting up the integration of government entities to faith and community-based organizations, established an executive order in 2004, a faith-based and community advisory council, which was then a year later codified in Florida statute and supported. We have 25 advisory members, 17 of which of the faith and community-based board, 17 of which are appointed by the governor, 4 are appointed by the House, the State House, and 4 appointed by the State Senate. So those 25 members really are our messengers and ambassadors throughout the state of just that one council, the Faith and Community-Based Council. We also have the board that oversees the foundation. We have other committees that support the work, and we have the 25 governor-appointed commissioners that do the work of the commission. So we tell everyone our organization is in sort of 4 rays of the sunshine. AmeriCorps is certainly our primary focus. We receive great funding from the Corporation of National and Community Service for AmeriCorps. We're very proud of that. We have about 700 AmeriCorps members serving under our grant today. And we take that oversight very seriously for that. That's one ray of sunshine. Second ray of the sunshine is disaster work. After Hurricane Andrew, many of you remember Hurricane Andrew in it's been 20 years now, I guess, but or so. But when Hurricane Andrew hit, we realized we probably did not do the best in mobilizing and volunteers and donations in Florida, and it was really much of a mess, and we needed to address that. So we learned from those experiences. So we now have 4 full-time staff dedicated to disaster work in Florida, and funding directly from our state and support from the private sector as well. So that's the second ray of the sunshine, is we're in official capacity in the state of Florida, and I'll elaborate later on that when we talk about that. The third ray of our 4 rays is whatever the sitting governor's priorities are. Take the initiatives and the priorities of the sitting governor and say, what can we do to address those important needs through service and through faith and community-based organizations and through the leadership of these councils that I'm mentioning to you? What can we do to maximize the efforts to get behind those initiatives? So that changes from governor to governor, and we're looking at environmental issues right now. We're looking at foster care, children who are aging out of foster care. We're looking at disability needs, education. There's so many wonderful initiatives that our governor is working with us on that we're excited about. Healthcare, of course, is very important. And then our fourth ray of sunshine is what the work of the foundation can do as well. And that's the faith and community-based initiatives, disaster recovery work through private donations coming to us through that foundation, and other initiatives as we see needs arise in our great state, which is a big state with a lot of issues that are important. So that's sort of a little snapshot. I hope that helps, Krista. We have 25 staff members in the commission, another dozen or so in the foundation. Probably between all of our councils and committees, I would guess maybe around 75 leaders in key leadership roles. And we work with millions of volunteers that we encourage, and hundreds of organizations that we work with in a formal, in memorandum of understanding, and informal capacity. So that's a quick snapshot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
In Texas, the One Star Foundation is a 501c3, but we are the state's really agency to be the state commission and to support the efforts of volunteerism and the strengthening of the nonprofit sector. That initiative, or any initiatives dealing around volunteers and voluntary organizations, and then later national service, has been connected to the Office of the Governor in Texas for 31 years, in different forms and different ways. Primarily, it's always just focused on recognizing volunteers and in equipping volunteer managers, and then administering our AmeriCorps state program. It was always generally part of another agency, so it had to share their mission. Because it was small, so they put it in an agency, and that had to either have a workforce focus, or one time it was in procurement because, well, they do grants. So what happened just over 4 years ago is Governor Rick Perry, in his inaugural speech, talked about creating a one-star foundation and moving those efforts outside of government, but as a partner of government. So we are a supporting nonprofit directly to the Office of the Governor instead of through another agency of government, for the purpose of letting it have its own mission, believing very strongly that there may be a lot more that the state ought to be engaged in with this important sector that is really providing so many of the services of the state, and that it would never ever fully be able to come into its own or be recognized as an equal partner with economic development and the Arts Commission and the Historical Commission if it wasn't an entity of its own. But he strongly felt that it didn't need to become another state agency, because that it was a place where the private and the public came together in such a unique and critical way, and that would be more difficult if it was structured as a formal state agency. So thus, a nonprofit was created and then attached, if you will, to state government through both an executive order of our governor and by a current statute that allows a state agency to have a supporting nonprofit and to provide services back and forth for each other. So the faith-based office had really been only a point of contact person up until that point, and so Governor Perry wanted to incorporate and just integrate all of our programs around volunteerism, in the sector systems, sector organizations, dump them in one place, and then just say, go have vision and do good, which was great because he didn't have a prescribed idea about what this expanded effort and focused mission or a mission on volunteerism should be. He just said, make it a national model and make us the best. So it was fun to take over and begin something like that, challenging too. When we began, our Faith-Based and Community Initiatives Office had no funds. We just had a lot of passion. And we had a lot going on. We were learning AmeriCorps. We had the Governor's Mentoring Initiative, and we were starting up a nonprofit all at the same time. For us, that was really good because when you don't have funds, you go talk to people. And you find really simple, creative ways to make an impact. And I would say maybe those first years, we maybe made more impact than we did last year, and now we're going back to the simple things. I think we'll get back to impact again. But what we did learn is we first looked as following the national lead was to look at the barriers within our government. Well, this was a state that President Bush was governor before, so most of those barriers had been addressed. And although the government always needs to, you pay attention and help them stay current on being open and equitable to all grantees and applicants, we realized that was not work that we needed to do. But what happened in Texas was because that work had happened and because there was an opening up of the opportunity for access to partner with government, it exposed a lot of other barriers that we said, this is a place we can focus in on. And I'll just run through them really quick because I love learning. I mean, the whole purpose of anything is just learning about what you need to be doing. But we learned that attitudes were going to be a barrier throughout the sector, ranging from indifferent to proactively hostile, and that we would need to address those things to have an equal opportunity for everyone. That there was a serious deficit of operational knowledge, jargon knowledge of the sector, process knowledge, grant management knowledge, or knowledge of how and where to find information and resources within the faith-based community. There was wrong understanding of the initiative. I'm a faith-based organization, I'm here for my money. We got lots of those emails, we truly did. And partly it came from the ignorance and the lack of understanding that it was set-asides. Sometimes it was just innocent, and sometimes people who were opponents of the initiative were setting up that scenario so that people would feel like they weren't getting what they were supposed to get. And so we had to do a lot of work in countering that. Fear of competition in the sector. Heightened because the belief that the standards would be lowered for faith-based organizations to participate. And, so it's just the assurances there that we don't want them to equip them to faith-based organizations to meet. We want them to exceed standards, which conversely I think scared them even more. And some of the real opponents of the initiative, and there are some, less and less today because of the excellent way it's been managed and led at the federal level. We also realize that faith-based organizations do not have anywhere near the same access and ability to access the diversity of funds as other types of nonprofits. Simply corporate charters will prohibit them from giving to nonprofits. Some private foundations are a little wary of doing so. So actually government has become the most open funder at this point in time in our history to faith-based organizations, and that's work we have to continue to do to break down the barriers in those other areas. And then there was a desire by some to keep the faith-based initiative segmented so that once, President Bush was gone, it would be gone. And so it was separate and somehow just keep the illusion that they were so different and so potentially dangerous maybe or so something that, okay, fine, have an initiative, but keep it separate from the whole sector. So based on that, we set out to take some key actions. We didn't want to compartmentalize and segregate the faith-based organizations from other types. So after our initial sort of real identification of an initiative sitting over here, that we just integrated it within everything. It crosses everything, and it is, because it's a focus of AmeriCorps, it's a focus of our mentoring, it's a focus of our capacity building and everything that we do. And so what we wanted to do was use ourselves to model what we wanted to see happen in the sector, but to be very intentional about making it happen and creating those dialogues and opportunity to find commonalities and see where the differences were unique, and to respect those differences and learn how to incorporate them in, and to understand that without everybody out there working and everybody at the table and everybody having access to the information and the resources that were available, that we were not doing our part corporately to really affect the common good. And that was a responsibility, and we felt it was a responsibility, a really great role for government to promote that, and with the power of their convening and the ability to do that. So we decided to do that, and it is, I mean, the areas of social need are the largest cost drivers of your state government budgets and your federal government budgets. So if you talk economics to them, they get a lot more interested in the sector, and when they realize they don't really understand how it operates, and where its gaps are, and why, if they knew more, maybe some of their initiatives would be more successful, and that there really needs to be a voice that they can look to, just like they go to the Texas Education Agency when they're going to do an education initiative. You know, they now are beginning to come to us to ask us if we see any flaws in the initiative they're going to roll out to the local community. So anyway, that's a really good thing. Out of it, and going into our 4th year in doing this, we're just kind of launching ourselves as we'll be One Star Foundation, the Texas Center for Social Impact. And we've arranged ourselves in 4 focus areas to be a microcosm of this sector, because we realize that every initiative has to deal with equipping volunteers, equipping voluntary organizations, and equipping sector systems, and then researching it all and bringing it together into learning. And so we'll have this, under our Texas Center for Social Impact will be service and volunteerism, nonprofit organizational excellence, social innovation and entrepreneurship, and research, education, and learning that they call the REAL team. And so we're very excited about the opportunity to focus on the sector as a holistic approach. Our goal is to increase awareness, and through, I should say, we have a cross-functional committee in our organization that focuses on faith-based, because integrating it's one thing, but you could lose it, and we don't want to lose it. And so you have to be very intentional, and it's at the forefront all the time of how do you equip for everything you're going to do. What are the unique needs that the faith-based and smaller community organizations, because they're very important and sparse in rural Texas and need to be strengthened also, many of which are faith-based organizations, but not all. But they have the same kind of needs, and so that we can be intentional about not leaving them out even as we're integrating them in. And so we do a lot to mix our all-grantee meetings every year. When we brought on our new programs in AmeriCorps, we're just AmeriCorps, and we'd have our faith-based grantees in another one. Now we have them together, and most of the time they're spending together, and they're learning, and there's tension sometimes. It's wonderful tension. And they're learning about each other, but they've found some new partners, and now some of the faith-based organizations are sites of the AmeriCorps program, which is a great place to start faith-based organizations often into understanding national service, because it's a hard program to manage, the AmeriCorps state. And so it promotes that dialogue, understanding, just they themselves break through the myths because they're interacting with one another, and learning. In the faith-based organization, if you can put them in with people who have had years more knowledge to learn the skill sets of grant management and those things, it's a peer-to-peer learning type of process. And so, we just make the whole process of getting money from One Star be about learning capacity. And so everything is a learning experience that we support with learning. And so anyway, I need to stop, I know. But the one thing that we have, the advantages of integrating all of this is obviously you can leverage your human resources internally, leverage your funds. the expertise, you can accumulate learning quicker, and you can see how it applies across the whole sector. And so you get a bigger picture, and I think you can craft your initiatives to have a multi-impact across the sector. Economies of scale, definitely we've noticed that. It allows us to support, we love it because when faith-based organizations may want to be an AmeriCorps program, but clearly it would actually be detrimental to them at that point because their capacity isn't strong enough and it's a very regulation-rich program, as it needs to be because it's human resources, we have a continuum of services to offer. And we can begin to engage with them at the basic capacity building, which that's what we do, AmeriCorps and capacity building. We don't do program funds. We solely build capacity within individual organizations in the sector at whole, and that's just where we decided we could make the biggest difference. And so we get to stay engaged with them over a period of time and watch them grow and develop, connect them to more mature organizations to learn from, and that has turned into having some outstanding faith-based organizations that could never have been, I think, a very good AmeriCorps program if they had just stepped into it to be some of our premier AmeriCorps programs. So, thank you.
Very good.
Thank you. And Sydney is in a different position. She is housed within a governor's office. And so Sydney, would you just tell us a little bit more about your model?
Sure. And I will just say I am delighted to be here with all of you today. And these women all at one point or another have served as mentors for me. I'm a little bit intimidated about following Michael and the ever-eloquent Jay Hine, but I slipped a note to him at a conference and said, "You have the greatest ideas," and I steal them all the time. And he threw out in a speech one time that what we're doing is serving the servants. And so that was the theme of our governor's faith-based conference and I fessed up. I told you that I borrowed that from you. So, and I love what I'm listening to the others, and I'll just paint in broad strokes because I think they've given you so much information. But what Susan said about not having money for the faith-based initiative causes you to reach out and have partners. And I'll go on record as saying that that I like to have money, but we do not have money for this. And so what she calls partnerships, we call making stone soup in Alabama. Remember the children's parable? Everybody kind of steps up and has nothing, and so you end up with something really great. But a brief overview of the office. When Governor Riley came into office as governor, we were the governor's office on national and community service. And then the president asked each governor to create an office of faith-based and community initiatives. And I am very biased, but I think the governor is a really smart guy. And he just kind of down to earth said, well, who cares more about service and volunteerism than faith-based organizations? And Jay mentioned earlier some statistics. And in Alabama, almost 50% of our volunteers come through faith-based organizations. So via executive order, he established Alabama Governor's Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives. And so in addition to the AmeriCorps program and implementing the faith-based initiative to enhance what we do, he added the Citizen Corps program, which I'm sure many of you know is a disaster preparedness and response program for citizens, not for the first responders, and those are 99% of the population are citizens. And he also added, we are written into our state emergency operation plan for Support Annex G, which is managing volunteers and donations in disasters. And you can bet that that effort is on all of our minds very much this morning. And then additionally, we have the Ready Alabama campaign, which is our public awareness campaign for providing our citizens with disaster preparedness and response training. And so, and work with the public and private sector. And really, if you look at an organizational structure, whether it's a chain, a hub, or a network, this office really serves as a hub for many of these efforts. And when you look at funding, we receive state funds, of course we receive some federal funds, but we also, I receive a lot of Homeland Security funds through the Alabama Department of Homeland Security to manage our efforts. And our governor has instructed us to stop managing programs through columns. He wants to see them funded horizontally. And so I have such great partnerships with my other state counterpart in cabinet positions, and so they will step up and fund some programs for us. And something that we're looking toward now, because I mentioned earlier, I'm tired of these bittersweet meetings where we say goodbye to Jay, and then we're soon going to say goodbye to David Eisner. But in Alabama, we're looking at what we've done and trying to lock it down so that we can never go back. That we always continue to progress. And I'll touch a little bit more on it later, but something in disaster preparedness and response is a little program that we have, which is called a Be Ready Camp, where we bring sixth graders in to train them on disaster preparedness and response, and they go back out to their communities, and they are youth preparedness delegates, and they go out and speak to the media and speak to their schools and speak to their churches on this effort. And the way that we select them, we ask them to apply via an essay, but then I insisted that we have some other opportunities, because I probably wasn't the best writer in the class and wouldn't have been accepted. So they can submit a videotape or a poster. And if you ever have a bad day, just drop by Alabama. We have some great videotapes of rising fifth graders. But probably my favorite application is because we tell these children, we're all hazards. We're just not about tornadoes. We're just not about hurricanes or even an act of terrorism. And so my soapbox for disaster preparedness is everybody can have a kit and a plan. If you don't do anything else, you can have a kit and a plan. So one young lady submitted an essay, and it was near and dear to my heart, because she said, we all need a kit and a family plan. And because we could be hit by anything. It could be a tornado, it could be a hurricane, or it could be an act of tourism. And so, so although we think that we're doing great outreach across state agencies, I did tell my Homeland Security Director we found a gap that we need to work with travel and tourism. And then additionally, we have the governor established, when he established the Office of Faith-Based Advisory Board, which is just mirrors the federal image. And that is so helpful to get the information, because the cabinet members sometimes are very busy, but to have someone housed in those organizations. And so that's a brief snapshot of our structure.
Thank you, Sydney. I'd like to turn our attention to capacity building activities. You've each mentioned it in a different way. Both Florida and Texas were recipients of a Compassion Capital Demonstration Fund, and were able to leverage that investment in their states. And Sydney and Alabama was not a recipient of a Compassion Capital Demonstration Fund, but they would receive that funding if somebody wanted to give that to them, and I'm sure they would use it very well. But I thought it might be a nice opportunity to talk about how that federal investment has been leveraged at the state and local level, and how those activities occur even without that type of boost and support. And I think, if we could, I'd like for, Susan, do you mind responding to this one first, since you've had the grant the longest and have moved on from that? And then Wendy, I'll ask you to respond, and then Sydney, if you could.
Okay, I think we fell in the year that it was an 18-month grant. Before then, I think it had been 3 years and then after. So we did a lot with the 18 months. And for us, it was a great opportunity to finally have some money to focus on learning more, and certainly supporting organizations on capacity building, but learning more. And in many of the things I talked about earlier, we learned out of that process too, and the things that we were doing. We had partner Cornerstone Assistance Ministries, and so it was a great time for us to do some learning and perfecting on how to do these types of partnerships, and they continue today to be a strong capacity intermediary type of capacity builder in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex area. We sort of, out of that, I will tell you that another really strong intermediary approach that is really an exciting one that I'm going to just mention briefly if we have time on the future thing, because I see a future for that, sprung up sort of out of that, was kind of already fledgling, but expanded its vision through the work of the CCF grant, and is now a really powerful intermediary supporting over 50 faith-based organizations in the Houston area. So we have seen the result of many changes due to the opportunity to have that to build capacity. What we did is we required anyone who was interested in going to apply for the money to have to come to 4 out of 6 workshops. They were full-day workshops. There was a lot of commitment of time. But it was the basics of operations and grants management. It was the things that you needed to know to be successful, because we don't want to give opportunity for partnership and not equip people to be set up for success and then have the headlines hurt us all. And so it was really huge. And we knew people came for the money, but later, after the ones that did get grants, and even many of the others said, you know, you really used the money well because we came for the money, and we gave small grants with a technical assistance package with it. We don't see ever doing anything different. You know, we think we need both. But we came for the money, but we really got what we needed in the technical assistance. And the money was just a carrot, and it became less helpful but less valuable as we understood it. And so that was a very important learning for us to do, because people will tend not to come and give 4 full days for technical assistance. But actually, it was very good. And it was really neat because a number of faith-based organizations left, and they were really excited. They felt like they had learned things to make their organization better, more attractive to contributors. But they definitely said, we are not the organization. We don't want to go after public funds because we understand that it won't fit our organization. But the workshops have made our organization better. We have Chris Bugby working with us, who used to be at the White House office here, and he explains it like to faith-based. It's so great, it's so easy that you're either a salad or a brownie. And so if, it's a real easy way to know if you should take public funds or not. A salad, you can pick out the tomatoes, you can pick out the celery and each individual piece, and you still have a salad. And so if you can do that to your organization, pull out the faith-centered type pieces, and you have the services there, then you can probably consider public funding. But if you put a brownie in and try to pull out the eggs, you don't have a brownie. So you can't. And there's faith-saturated organizations. And so that's just, I'll pass it on because I think it's such a great way to quickly determine if an organization might be good for that or not. Anyway, what we learned also, it was as important to equip secular organizations to understand how to work with faith-based organizations as it was to equip the faith-based organizations, because there was a fear factor. Fear from the fact of, just will they get us in trouble, or just not understanding how they work, and so that there could be better partnerships. And faith-based organizations make great partners with collaborative partners because they just tend to be collaborators. And so anyway, that was something important we learned about it. We also learned that probably the most important thing, a piece of capacity for a nonprofit organization, this is where I think the corporation can engage even more fully, is the volunteer management excellence. That is going to always be faith-based organizations' greatest resource. I mean, that is, all studies show, that is where volunteers come from in great, great numbers. And first and foremost, they tend to want to volunteer with faith-based faith-based organizations. But managing those human resources you've got to have a strong volunteer management system, because not only for the organizations itself to make impact, but from the state government's perspective, is that that's a workforce that without which the state, local, or federal government could not replace those services. And so, we're going to be putting a lot of focus on really on that. But this is a great area for strengthening capacity in the faith-based sector. And then just a few things we have done as far as although we integrate faith-based across the organizations, we still offer some services that are primarily intended for that group, because they have some unique needs and they're at a different level of knowledge and understanding and access. So we realize that process is everything to capacity building. If you don't know the processes to get all these different grants and partnerships with the government and doing things, you're not going to be successful. So as I said before, we build our whole process into it's a learning. So when we have the application, we support it with learning about the process, so that you're actually building capacity while you're applying for grants and while you're managing your grants and everything. And so we just see it as a way to educate. Recently, a new thing we just did is exciting. We got some gift cards from the Foundation Center, and the Foundation Center is a place you can go research all kinds of funding opportunities. And so we're on a kind of a competitive basis, giving those to faith-based organizations for a year to have access to the Foundation Center. And we have experimented with, and it was actually successful, and these are some of the simple things we're going back to that I think have had the greatest impact, is we did conference call trainings. We found experts on various things, like when a prisoner reentry opportunity came from the federal government. We weren't going to get those grant funds and grant amounts, so we had no conflict of interest in helping organizations, understand how to approach that grant. And so we got experts who understood it and had conference calls so that, because, see, we wanted that money to come to Texas. So it was the benefit of the state to equip our organizations to compete well for it. And also we convened several groups of faith-based organizations who each of them we knew were, because we had relationship, said we're going to apply for it. Each one we knew on their own could probably not get it. And so we asked them to come to the table and talk about a collaborative effort. And through that, we won 2 of those grants in Texas, I think because they had strong collaborations and those resources came in. So I think from a state perspective, you want to help your sector bring more resources to your state and not go, sorry, to Florida or to Louisiana. Although I want you all to get plenty of stuff too. Okay, thank you.
Well, in interest of time, I think Susan did an outstanding job of explaining the grant. Same story with us. The opportunity to gather faith in grassroots, real focus on grassroots. There are nonprofits that run better than the private sector in some cases, many cases, but grassroots organizations, big ideas, but not much infrastructure. So we set up regional workshops, peer-to-peer learning sessions, one-on-one technical support, and many grants from $2,000 to $20,000. It was very, very helpful. So it's been just an amazing leverager and a great opportunity for us. So thanks.
Well, just quickly, as was mentioned, we did not receive a Compassion Capital grant, but we do, but I'm not bitter. But we do a lot of what Susan outlined just by working with state agencies as they do their grant outreach process. Then we ask that they help to build the capacity, and then in the monitoring process, work with the organizations as well. We also work closely with our state agency. I mentioned we had liaisons within our state agencies, and so I really do serve as a liaison to them and bring a lot of information back. And I may not have a lot of knowledge, but I know who to partner with them with, either at the state or national level. And then we work with our community foundations, which are our philanthropic intermediaries. And so working with them to educate them that faith-based organizations are eligible for the funding. And even if they're not a large organization with enough capacity, they can piggyback and be sub-grantees of some grants. And again, as Susan mentioned, there's training involved as all of that goes along. And then finally, with our Nonprofit Resource Center of Alabama, which for lack of a better term is the trade association for our nonprofits. And they do a lot of training around the state. So they're really our training arm for the nonprofits and have developed not a separate faith-based training track, but to make sure that the faith-based piece is implemented into all of their trainings.
Great, thank you. I think each of you have mentioned the responsibility that you have of helping advance your governor's priorities. And one of those shared priorities among your 3 states and then across the United States in some capacity, but in a very kind of present way, is disaster preparedness, relief, and recovery. And Wendy in Florida have had perhaps a burden for a longer period of years because of weather patterns of getting really good at doing this. And so what I'd like for each of you to do for everyone is just talk a bit about how you're seeing this integration, this approach of working together with volunteers and faith-based and community organizations. How is that playing itself out on the ground in your communities to be really good at disaster preparation, relief, and recovery? Wendy, I'm going to ask you if you would, because you have such a great amount of experience with this, to set the table for us. And then Sydney, maybe you could talk a bit about your focus on preparation. And Susan, if there's anything you'd like to add, we'll do that. We're within 15 minutes of our end time, so there's a couple other questions I want to get to if we have time.
Well, great. Well, we say we're getting good at this because we've made more mistakes than anyone else because we've had more opportunities to do so. But as I mentioned, after 1992 with Andrew, it was a bit of a mess. I don't need to sugarcoat that, but we learned from that mess. And I'm gonna circle back to something that just happened in the last 4 days. What does the Seventh-day Adventist, a Boy Scout troop, a 211 information and referral service, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, a faith-based non-denominational group called ACTS, active community team services disaster team all have in common with emergency management and Volunteer Florida. So follow me on this. This just happened. After Faye hit, and Tropical Storm Faye, historically, no disaster has ever hit the same state 4 times in the history of the world. 4 times. She just kept beating us, and we promised we weren't that bad. But it really did. It really actually was very tragic. Unfortunately, 14 people have perished. And I don't know if you know this fact, but outside of the major catastrophes like Andrew and Katrina, the largest disaster that occurs with deaths each year is flooding. I don't know if you knew that or not, but flooding causes more deaths year in and year out than any disaster there is. So it's very, very tragic, but you have to be prepared to get it. So remember all those organizations. ACTS, the non-denominational faith disaster group, erected a large circus tent on the grounds of the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Melbourne. The Church of the Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints provided the flood kit buckets that the ACTS volunteers distributed to the residents who received a questionnaire from Boy Scouts. You follow me with this? Asking about what their needs might be, and also did an assessment on who had saturated drywall, who was flooded out in their flooring and everything. The Boy Scouts also handed out maps and registration forms and helped wherever needed. The Brevard County 211 referral service, that's down in that eastern central part of Florida, served as a link between the survivors who called emergency managers and these agencies and this network of groups, and Volunteer Florida as the emergency coordinating officer and the emergency support function for the state of Florida, all integrated together. Well, that's a great lesson, isn't it? I mean, about how everyone integrated together, the synergy. What do you have that we can maximize? That's what didn't happen. In many cases in Katrina, did not happen in Hurricane Andrew, but that is what's happening today, and that's what will happen with Hurricane Hannah, if it hits us, and Hurricane Gustav, is that organizations now are communicating, and they're not working in silos. They're working together. The Red Cross, Salvation Army. I had a leader of one of our faith organizations who was in our emergency management office all week with us, said, for the first time, Wendy, we've actually reached out to another denomination, and we're talking about providing volunteers to prepare and distribute the food that they're cooking in their equipment. This is fabulous, folks, and that's what we do as a state agency, a state entity, as Volunteer Florida, is we help make those connections on the preparation end, on the communication, by signing memorandum of understandings in advance, by categorizing what assets everyone has. We can tell you what every faith-based and relief organization, what their capacity is, what their assets are, how much food, supplies, volunteers do they have on hand, what can they bring into the state, what are all those assets, and then we take the need on the local level, talking to that county manager, listen to that local United Way, that local volunteer center, what are those needs, and we help mobilize that. Relief organizations have these assets, have had them for decades. We just didn't have a very good method or mechanism to connect the two for success.
Well, I'll just add a little bit what overarching principles, what it looks like at Alabama, because Wendy brought some of her staff to Alabama several years ago to help us set up our disaster preparedness and response training. And at the state level, I mentioned the Citizen Corps program. That is our program. That's our boots on the ground. We've set up councils in every single county. That's the group that brings the stakeholders in. They assess the risk and determine what education and training their citizens need. And then I mentioned the Ready Alabama campaign, readyalabama.org. It's a campaign looking for the trusted messenger, because I always say, if Bob Riley tells me to get a kit and a plan, I'm going to get a kit and a plan. But some people really don't trust government. So we have to reach out through PSAs, through weather forecasters. Some people only trust their pastors. So we have many, many initiatives under the Ready Alabama campaign, such as Be Ready Camp, Be Ready Sunday, Be Ready Day, and I won't go into the details, that's all available online. But I think what we're most successful at is letting the locals tailor the program. Something that we've seen is that we want a citizen core council in every county, but we also want a local VOAD. We have a state VOAD, Voluntary Organizations Active in Disasters, but we want a local VOAD. And so, and then finally, Wendy mentioned how to sort of corral and manage the affiliated volunteers, the faith-based organizations, but you have thousands of spontaneous volunteers which will pour into the area. And so we have the capability in every county to stand up a volunteer reception center, which is not where volunteers come to get coffee. They actually come in and are trained and credentialed, and then they respond to where emergency management or local law enforcement officials want them. It's kind of a triple benefit. You get the free labor, law enforcement doesn't have to turn people away from the area, and then also, I don't have time for the details of it, but those volunteer hours, which I think Wendy was actually the person that taught me this, if they're carefully tracked, can be used for a percentage of a FEMA match, which is huge. And in our enterprise tornadoes, which is a small rural area, the first week alone, that was $1 million in volunteer services, which they were able to use. So, but we see that that's a cycle, that if we can get a citizen core council, then we know that we can get a VOAD or set up a volunteer reception center. So if anybody plugs in into one, we know that we can stand up that capability in every county.
Wonderful, thank you very much. I'd like for each of you, if you would, just to talk a bit about, and you touched on it, we just had a moment to talk about capacity building and then how it's playing itself out in this particular policy space of emergency preparedness. Could you each speak a bit about how combining and leveraging these two initiatives has allowed you to strengthen your infrastructure to deliver services? And Wendy, could you lead us off on that?
Sure. Now, do you mean an example? I've got a great example of volunteer capacity in one particular community. Can I tell about that? Okay. This is another trivia quiz. What do the Lutherans, the Presbyterians, the Methodists, the Catholic, Church of Christ, the Episcopals, and the Jewish have in common in Naples, Florida? They all got together this year, and they are together, united, are going to establish the very first volunteer center in Collier County, Florida. How exciting that is. Under a vision by a gentleman named Don Scott, he went to these faith organizations and he said, we have needs in our community, we have people who want to help, we have disasters that are striking often our state and our region, and you have congregations, you have resources, you have people that we can energize and mobilize. So he received commitments, financial support, in-kind services, they all signed a document. Funding, I mentioned that, marketing to their congregations, sharing of congregation lists to promote volunteer needs, and also they'll jointly address and work with local county officials on identifying needs in the community that they can address through their congregations and beyond. This is just setting up the infrastructure. Those who aren't obviously members of those organizations are going to be welcomed, but that is the infrastructure. We only know of one other that I've been able to find in Hartford. It's called Hands on Hartford. That's very similar to this. There may be others out there, but I'm very encouraged that faith organizations can get together around community needs like this in such an aggressive way. And so we're excited. Stay tuned. We're having that grand opening soon, and I hope in a year or so we're going to have a lot of results from that. They're positive. It's one example.
Well, we align everything to our capacity building, so our state had a lot of people working on volunteer matching, and so we didn't want to, being kind of seeing the new guy, to step on their toes, so we looked for some gaps. And then in line with our capacity building, we're focusing a lot on, and where the corporation actually is leading now, and we're excited about, is the skills-based efforts to connect people to skills-based volunteering and pro bono services on professional services to help build up your operational capacity. And again, the wealth of those services in the congregations and houses of worship today are huge. And it's just understanding and equipping to assess a volunteer coming in and going, you might want to use the accountant more to work on setting up books in preparation to get a grant, where you have to do a lot more sophisticated accounting than actually on the front line delivering food. And so you can maximize your resources. And so we're going to be focusing on expanding that. And it's not diverting people from certainly direct services. I think it's going to add volunteers because there's a number of people that really have a heart for community and like us, capacity builders. And I am a capacity builder. That's where my strength is. And it's about the community, but my skill sets are operations and organization and strengthening. And so, maybe I wouldn't be as engaged if I didn't have that as a venue to volunteer in. And so I think we can tap into a lot of underutilized or unused resources, and I think they're sitting right in our houses of worship, and so just equipping you all to better use those resources. On the disaster side, something similar to Sydney, and I'll just mention it briefly, and is a way of preparedness that we're really excited about. Everything on responding, which apparently we're going to be doing potentially very quickly with Gustav and Hannah, either us or Sydney or both. And Wendy is she's there when we need her, and her whole team. And so we have relief knowing that we've got that support system. So everything she's doing, we'll be doing because that's what we learn from. But what we also did learn is when areas are hit by a disaster, the nonprofits that are also hit, when they're in the area of disaster, over 60% of them never come back online. And so that is, immediately something we went, that's not good because they're going to be needed there. Now others will come in, but, you kind of, in the same way as your houses of faith, worship, congregations are usually your first responders or your shelters, even if it wasn't set up to be that way. They often are. And so our project is this continuity of operations plan that every business is really focused on having, that we're going to pledge to our governor that over a period of at least 5 years, that every nonprofit in our state and every house of worship will have a continuity of operation plan. We're going to offer to house it on our server so that they have a backup plan. And then we're going to ask, if they do two things, have a plan so that they are prepared to come back online and help their community. So take care of themselves first so they can take care of others. And then the other thing is that, in doing that they equip every single staff member if it's in the nonprofit or congregant if it's in the church to have a plan and a kit. And so Texas has, it's a very strong faith-based state, so we can touch a lot of Texans that way in kind of a simple way. So we're excited about that.
I'll just use one quick example of what we're doing in Alabama. Actually, I think today is Friday, unless I've lost track of time. This afternoon, we will be shutting down a call center where we've contacted every single church, mosque, and synagogue in the state of Alabama, and just asking them, just like Wendy mentioned, we know what capabilities they have for disasters, but asking them what problems are they addressing in their areas, whether it's prisoner reentry, whether it's disaster preparedness and response, whether it's dropout prevention. And so then we're asking them, can we contact you again? Would you be willing to partner with government in certain areas? And so I think that we've already used that with DHR, our Department of Human Resources, with some social services for seniors that were cut. But we're going to share that list and then ask them if we can share that within their community so that maybe we can stop a little bit of duplication of services. And I think the one lesson learned from that is that most of these organizations really do want to partner, but we just need to ask them.
Thank you. Well, in the spirit of trying to stay to our schedule, just one last question, and this is really forward-focused. Each of you are just sitting on some pretty exciting things that are about to happen, I think, and ideas about this initiative moving forward. If you could just close us out with a few words about your vision casting forward and how you see things playing out in your states in the near and not so near future.
That's great. I think the real magic sits in the leadership of the state with these governors, and having governors' support for service and civic engagement and for helping faith and community-based organizations, having them speak those words and letting your states know that it's important, and the value, as Jay pointed out and as Michael pointed out, the value, just the sheer economic value, but the value of the outreach that faith and community-based organizations can do to address these important social service needs asking our governors to continue that message. Government organizations, some have been around for decades and some are new to us recently, do a very good job of meeting needs in our states. But I believe that grassroots organizations, nonprofits, faith organizations really embrace the communities they work in. They nurture the population, they nurture citizens. They take it a whole new step forward. And I think that the magic is between the faith and community-based organization and what the state can do, all with the leadership from the governor and hopefully also our president. And so I think that's where the real magic is spreading the word.
Well, I just want to say thank you, Jay. And I hope I came from Texas to share, and I know I've shared a lot, but because we're enthusiastic and passionate, but to do it as a gift to you, because it's your legacy. And this has been a great initiative, but it was really under Jay's leadership that he started to say, we've got to move this down to the states and engage the state offices. And so I hope today, when you're hearing from the three of us, which is just a sampling of what's going on, is one of the greatest gifts we can give to say thank you on this day that you're going to leave to continue to support these things, because it is where it has to happen. And it can't be seen as optional. It can't be seen as here today and gone tomorrow. As Wendy said, I think every chief executive officer, if it's federal, local, state government, needs to feel it's a responsibility on their part to utilize every single asset and resource in their community. And that they can't find excuses for it, and that they have to be bold enough to speak up against, and correct any attempts to try to segment it, politicize it, or anything else, because it's what they owe the people of the state, because they are the greatest resources, and in good times and bad times, they're needed. They're desperately needed. So for us, I think the next step is to really begin to continue to institutionalize this in the state, that you can't just pull it out and take it. It's going to be a brownie, okay? We want to make this a brownie in Texas, and so we're looking really at what processes, infrastructure, and systems need to be in place to ongoing support. And obviously, outside just a state entity, we can't do it all. So that's why I was saying we're kind of seeing the future and potentially local intermediaries. And some of these are not that people came in to decide to be an intermediary, but an exciting example was a whole group of faith-based organizations from all different denominations recognize their capacity builders, the ones that are the good organizational, operational people, and they set up an intermediary to support all of their work. And so they apply for grants some, they work some as a fiscal agent, they provide technical assistance, they find the skilled-based volunteers to go, when the organizations, they assess them and have a need. So it's building your self-support systems among collaborative groups is something that intrigued us. It seems very successful. They're getting very good funding success because it has a good business, it makes sense to business investors. And so we want to look at that and perhaps seed some money into seeing a little bit more of that happen in Texas and see what might happen. So again, Jay, thank you, and all that your predecessors have led to this, and we will not let the fire go out.
Just as I quickly wrap up, Krista mentioned that she might want us to offer some words of encouragement, and when I was for the initiative, and when I thought about that, the first thing I thought of was, there is some bad news. We all know that there are many, many complicated problems. The problems are interwoven, and you can't just have one solution. Say for homelessness, put a person in a house and they're fixed. We know that. And so, is that a conundrum, or is that a benefit to us? Because as we address one problem, we're actually unraveling and teasing apart and addressing many other problems. And so you've probably heard the expression, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. Well, that's what we're all doing, but I think it's having far-reaching effects on many of these issue areas.
Thank you so much for your time this morning. Will you all join me in thanking our panelists? Well, I was reading a great book this morning, and one of the things it said was in Psalms 126, what we sow in tears, we reap with sheaves of joy. And for me, this moment is really about that. You know, I like to say this about the privilege I've had to serve at city, state, and national government now, is that I have never met a heartless bureaucrat. I haven't. I've met a lot of heartbroken bureaucrats and servants. And this initiative and the partnership with volunteerism in so many different ways, boy, it just breathes life into how that can change for good and redeem forever some of the pain that we share with our neighbors. And so I thank you all so much for your service, for each of you in this room who are also servants, and would like to invite Jay up to dismiss us. Is that right? Yep. Thank you, Jay. Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yep. I think we're at the time. So what I'm going to do is just thank Krista, who, as she just referenced, has been laboring in this field a long time and has served us faithfully. She's been very effective in organizing the story and the assets, so we're in your debt, and I'm thankful for that. But we are against the time limit, so I'm going to wish you well, and thank you so much. We have a smart team up here, don't we? I have been inspired. I would like to embarrass them just one more time because they did a great job today. Thank you all. Have a good day.
Thank you.